There is a county in Virginia named for or by every English monarch from Elizabeth I to George II, along with a handful of other counties and towns named for their princes and princesses. That's more than 200 years of royal heritage ingrained into the Old Dominion's very landscape. From its namesake and its home to the first permanent English settlement in North America, royal heritage carries deep roots here, all the way to the very beginning of European colonization in North America. Virginia has hosted perhaps a greater number, but undoubtedly a greater variety, of high-profile royal visits than any other state in the American Union. Virginia's historic relationship with the British monarchy offers an extraordinary perspective of our own history, as much as the history that we share with our mother country. Official state visits from monarchs whose crucial reigns changed the course of history, to unofficial visits from obscure princes and princesses, humanize the power, heritage, and intrigue of Virginia's royal visits. On May 14, 1607, English settlers came ashore on a swampy island some 40 miles upriver from the Atlantic Ocean. The promise of wealth stemming from rumors of gold and a water route to the Pacific Ocean inspired European colonists to make the perilous journey to this isolated edge of the known world. Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in North America. All of this vast continent that was not claimed by the French or Spanish was officially named Virginia in honor of England's reigning monarch, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. The colonists didn't find gold in the Tidewater region, but they did find that growing tobacco to export to England had the potential to generate a considerable amount of money. The scarcity and expense of importing poor European laborers hampered the profits of early cultivators. Beginning in 1619, African slaves were imported to Virginia as a cheaper and more easily obtainable source of agricultural labor. As slave labor helped fuel English colonization, towns and plantations began encroaching further into Native American land. The English inevitably clashed with the Powhatan tribe, whose spears and clubs were no match for gunpowder. These vast and unprecedented movements of people would influence everything, not least of all foreign relations with distant monarchs, whose reigns were still centuries away. By the end of the 17th century, eastern Virginia had blossomed into a burgeoning colony, with farms, plantations, and towns carved out of sprawling forests. The colonial capital moved from the walled settlement at Jamestown to Williamsburg in 1699, where a new town with planned streets more befitting of Virginia's growing status as a place of importance could develop. The College of William and Mary, today the second oldest institution of higher education in the United States, was established here by royal charter in 1693. Trades and local commerce flourished, and the very beginnings of representative government as we know it in this country had taken root. Modeled on the English Parliament, the House of Burgesses convened in Williamsburg with the royal governor appointed by the king to decide local laws and determine local taxation. More than 400 years after its establishment, the Virginia General Assembly today holds distinction as the oldest continuous lawmaking body in the Western Hemisphere. English understanding of law, commerce, religion, and culture, institutions that have brought degrees of progress to the world, had taken root in Virginia and spread throughout British North America. By the 1770s, however, the colonists' frustration with lack of representation in Parliament, as much as the Crown's attempts to temper their desire for westward expansion into formally recognized Native American territory, had reached the boiling point. A long, bitter, and expensive war for independence came to an end in 1781, when the British Army, commanded by Lord Cornwallis, surrendered to the Continental Army at Yorktown. The signing of the conclusive peace treaty at the end of the war was depicted in the painting titled Treaty of Paris by Benjamin West. The painting, however, was never completed, as the British commissioners refused to pose for the artist. The new United States of America blurred the concepts of nobility that dominated the kingdoms of the Old World. But British ideas of representative government and systems of checks and balances to limit the power of government directly influenced the framers of the American Constitution. Relations between the United Kingdom and the United States would once again devolve into hostility during the War of 1812. Though as each other's primary trading partners, their relationship had become necessarily, and at times even begrudgingly, symbiotic by the mid-19th century. As the United States was becoming a more significant economic and political force on the world stage, its relationship with Europe's major powers was also evolving, not least of all that with its former mother country. Virginia's first royal visit took place in this rapidly changing climate during the reign of Queen Victoria in 1860. As an expression of gratitude for colonial troops sent to fight in the Crimean War, the Queen dispatched her 18-year-old son and heir, Prince Albert Edward, on a tour of Canada. Catching wind of the tour, and also wishing to forge diplomatic goodwill with Great Britain, American President James Buchanan invited the Prince of Wales for an official visit to the United States before returning home. The Prince and his entourage of diplomats arrived in Washington on October 3rd and were welcomed with a grand reception at the White House. The state visit's busy itinerary included several days in the Old Dominion, the first stop of which was at Mount Vernon, the home of America's first president and most preeminent founding father, George Washington. Having only recently been acquired from the Washington family by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who still oversee the operation of Mount Vernon today, their tour of the mansion fascinated the prince. Led by President Buchanan, the party also visited Washington's tomb down the hill from the house, a scene captured by a sketch artist for Harper's Weekly. The sketch inspired the noted American painter Thomas P. Rossiter to immortalize the scene in vivid color. In less than a century, the home of George Washington, a man who would have been hanged for treason had the British Army been able to subdue the American Revolution, had become a shrine to the American public. Despite the successful visit to Mount Vernon, the air in America was tense in 1860. The bitter adversarialism between northern and southern states over the issue of slavery, and the power struggle between the federal government and state governments, was pushing young America to the point of crisis. Keen to avoid any hotbeds of tension, the prince's visit did not initially include any visits to southern states, although pressure from prominent southern lawmakers forced a change in the itinerary. The royal delegation arrived by train in Richmond on October 6th, where the prince was received with fanfare by a crowd of thousands. Anxious lawmakers showed the prince around the capital. The next day, the prince attended church at St. Paul's on Grace Street and met with Governor Letcher. Behind the gracious displays, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense. From the moment the prince stepped foot in Richmond, the newspapers began a feud that gripped readers for weeks. The New York Times alleged that the prince's rooms at Ballard's Hotel, one of Richmond's finest lodging houses that once stood here on 14th Street, were dirty, and insisted, contrary to eyewitness claims, that churchgoers ungracefully rose to their feet when the prince was escorted down the aisle to his seat. Newspapers in cities across Virginia fired back in response, and the New York Times returned the volley, characterizing working-class people in Richmond as animals. In language that was shockingly severe for the period, the Richmond Dispatch simply replied to the New York Times that there was more grace in one street in Richmond than in all the city of New York put together. While in Richmond, the prince was advised by the British government to avoid any discussion of political discord, particularly the subject of slavery, with which the United Kingdom itself had a muddy history. Parliament had only outlawed slavery in the British Empire a generation earlier in 1834. Although the empire had played a major role in creating the dark stain of slavery in the American colonies, the British government had since invested considerable resources in fighting the slave trade on the high seas, and had no wish to create a scene that might unintentionally endorse slavery in the Americas. The British legation in Washington scrambled to demand that the city of Richmond cancel its regularly scheduled slave auction while the Prince of Wales was in town, to which the city begrudgingly agreed. Just when crisis was thought to have been averted, the southern gentry were gearing down on their charm offensive. By the autumn of 1860, lawmakers in many southern states had begun to accept that civil war with the northern states was likely inevitable. The once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to charm the heir to the British throne on home soil was a chance to lay the diplomatic foundation for future recognition of an independent confederation of southern states, and perhaps even a formal military alliance with the world's foremost empire. Planters began to pressure the prince to visit their plantations along the James River. One of Richmond's most prominent citizens, Bowling Haxall, was especially eager to impress. Having just completed his fashionable Italianate townhouse the year before, Haxall also owned a plantation a couple of miles away in the vicinity of Westham Road, which roughly traced the course of the present-day Park Avenue. After successfully coaxing the prince to see his plantation, Haxall attempted to give him a special tour of his slaves and the ramshackle cabins they lived in. Disgusted by the prospect, the prince flatly refused. His patience with the American South had finally been exhausted. The heir to the throne cut short the rest of the tour and returned to Washington on the next train, axing tentative destinations in the American South as far away as South Carolina. The Old Dominion's first royal visit had been a bumpy one that ended in disappointment for all parties involved. A few months later, tension finally hit the flashpoint and erupted into a brutal civil war that would devastate the American South. Despite their attempts to influence the Prince of Wales during his visit in 1860, the United Kingdom ultimately refused to recognize the independence of the Confederacy. London and Richmond never exchanged ambassadors. Though caught in an interdependent web of trade between both the Union and the Confederacy, the United Kingdom navigated a frosty diplomatic tightrope for several tedious years. Dust from the Civil War had scarcely settled when another of Queen Victoria's sons, 19-year-old Prince Arthur, made his own pilgrimage to Mount Vernon while touring Canada and the United States as part of his military training. Himself only 19 years old, and but the third son of Queen Victoria, Prince Arthur's visit to Virginia's shrine to the American Republic was of considerably lower profile than that of his older brother 9 years earlier. From 1911 to 1916, Prince Arthur would eventually serve as Governor-General of Canada, the administrator and representative of the monarch to the Canadian government as a dominion of the British Empire. In the summer of 1900, Princess Marie Louise also landed in the United States. The princess was one of Queen Victoria's many granddaughters, and was first cousin to the German Emperor Wilhelm II. Although Marie Louise was naturally close to the nerve centers of European power, she herself was not directly in line to the British throne. Her visit, therefore, did not carry the same degree of formality as an official state visit, which gave her the freedom to engage with people more casually. The British ambassador, Lord Pauncefort, welcomed Marie Louise to Washington with a grand dinner party at the British Embassy, the opulent Second Empire-style building that once stood here on Connecticut Avenue. There was no diplomatic reception with President McKinley at the White House, although as an honored guest, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay took the princess to the Capitol, where she observed members of Congress debate from the gallery of the Senate chamber. The Secretary of State also arranged a day trip on the presidential yacht to Mount Vernon. A small entourage of British diplomats joined Hay and the princess to pay homage at the home of George Washington, which became one of the most highly publicized events of the visit. Seeking no special privilege for royalty, the princess paid the appropriate admission fee, even at the insistence of being welcomed free of charge as a dignitary. After touring the house, its extensive grounds, and Washington's tomb, the princess praised the Mount Vernon Ladies Association for their hard work in preserving and interpreting their monument to the American Republic. Despite the warm reception in Washington and the high-profile trip to Mount Vernon, there were other, deeply personal reasons for Princess Marie Louise's visit. Specifics have become murky with time, but enough details remain to piece together an unfortunate story. In early 1900, an affair between a male servant and the princess's husband, Prince Heribert, had been exposed. Her father-in-law, the Duke, unfairly blamed Marie-Louise for the affair, who spiraled into a deep, months-long depression. Refusing to shoulder the blame any longer for either her husband's infidelity or his sexual orientation, Marie-Louise rebelled. She packed her belongings and left. Without bothering to inform either her husband or the government, Marie-Louise herself sent a telegram to the British ambassador in Washington and told him that she was coming. Neither the public nor the British establishment in Washington were aware of the marital discord going on behind closed doors. The extended royal family had managed to keep the affair a secret. Prince Heribert was enraged by his wife's flight, and after several months of tolerating her extended tour of Canada and the United States, decided to intervene. A telegram arrived ordering Marie-Louise to come home, an order she flatly refused. An hour later, a second telegram arrived from Queen Victoria that said simply, "Tell my granddaughter to come home to me." Unwilling to disobey her beloved and powerful grandmother, Marie-Louise sailed for home to deal with the fallout and eventual annulment of her marriage. The true circumstances behind the princess's visit to the United States and the Old Dominion remained secret for many years. Prince Louis of Battenberg, great-grandfather of King Charles III, visited Mount Vernon a few years later in 1905, as did the future King Edward VIII in 1919 while he was still Prince of Wales. Following the example set by his grandfather in 1860, the prince planted an English yew tree near Washington's tomb. By the early decades of the 20th century, Mount Vernon had become a de rigueur stop for nearly every kind of royal visit to the eastern United States, a tradition that carries on up to the present. Up until then, these visits portrayed a diplomatic relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States that was congenial, though not necessarily one that was rooted in a close alliance or shared foreign policy objectives. But all that was about to change. Political and economic instability in Europe after the First World War was changing the geopolitical landscape like nothing ever seen before. By the 1930s, the dark power lust of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis had cast a pall over the West. Through conquest and human rights atrocities of unprecedented scale, fascism was redrawing the map of Europe, destroying anyone who stood in its path. By the end of the decade, the United Kingdom was Europe's last remaining bastion of democracy, a situation that was becoming increasingly untenable. President Franklin Roosevelt was keenly aware of the precarious state of democracy in the West, and the threat to America's own security that would be posed if the United Kingdom fell to the Nazis. Two-thirds of the American electorate opposed involvement in Europe, a conviction also shared by powerful bipartisan factions within Congress. Believing strongly in the need for Anglo-American cooperation at this crucial moment in history, Roosevelt took the unprecedented step of inviting King George VI and his consort Queen Elizabeth for an official visit to the United States. Their Majesties accepted the President's invitation, with both parties hoping that the visit would win support from the American people for the war that was looming over the horizon. More than 300 years after the beginning of British colonization in the Western Hemisphere, this was the first time a reigning monarch would set foot in North America. Almost 500,000 people crowded the streets of Washington to witness the King and Queen's arrival on June 8, 1939. Diplomatic receptions and entertainments befitting the magnitude of the occasion occupied the first day of the visit. But wasting no time, their Majesties joined the President and First Lady the very next day to tour Mount Vernon. The King laid a wreath at Washington's tomb, after which he and the Queen were given a tour of the mansion. On their way back to Washington, the party stopped briefly at Arlington National Cemetery to lay a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, himself a stark reminder of Allied cooperation in the last great European war. A reigning British monarch paying tribute to the American Republic at the home of its most prolific founding father was powerful and unprecedented. Despite the intense Virginia heat, the royal couple charmed American citizens and power brokers alike. They humanized the historical link between nations and their shared interests on the world stage. An overwhelming success, the 1939 state visit fostered communion between the two nations, which itself began to gradually shift public opinion on American involvement in another major war. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor 2 years later, the United States was finally ready to fight and declared war against the Axis powers. 4 years and millions of lives later, the Allied victories in Europe and Asia had once more made the world safe for democracy. Its foundations having been laid by the King and Queen's official visit in 1939, the modern Anglo-American alliance that was forged more than 80 years ago has endured ever since.
It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
The Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret arrive at the station. The train draws out, and the King begins his last journey to his capital, 100 miles away. In London, guards of honor from the three services take up their position in Palace Yard, Westminster. It is a grey and bitterly cold day. Now at King's Cross, the royal train draws in. For the Queen, his daughter, the widowed Queen, his wife, and Princess Margaret, the great ordeal begins, as George VI returns to his sorrowing capital.
The sudden death of King George VI in 1952 shocked the English-speaking world. His 26-year-old daughter Elizabeth was now queen of an empire that wrapped around the globe. Her ascension was widely met with optimism, heralded as a new Elizabethan age. But this new Elizabethan age would be very different from the first. Centuries of imperial avarice by Europe's most powerful monarchies had led the world into two devastatingly brutal world wars that toppled the thrones of Russia, Germany, and Italy, leaving the United Kingdom as Europe's last major power still ruled under the scepter of monarchy. The age of empire was over. It was now the Soviet Union and the United States who dominated the world stage. Bookended by republicanism to the west and communism to the east, it was still uncertain precisely what British rule would look like in this post-war landscape that was still taking shape. What was clear was that the age of royal authority and dynastic marriage as driving forces in global politics had passed. And in this changing environment, where people were more willing than ever to question privilege and authority, the British royal family understood that the new Queen's reign was an opportunity for reinvention. The House of Windsor would have to demonstrate their value to the public more than ever before, by being active and being visible. Despite her innate shyness, Queen Elizabeth II understood this need to be seen. and from the very beginning of her reign became a queen on the move, visiting member states of the British Commonwealth and beyond. But no member of the House of Windsor was better suited for public relations than the Dowager Queen, stylized in her widowhood simply as the Queen Mother. In the autumn of 1954, the Queen Mother embarked on a several weeks-long goodwill tour of Canada and the United States. The second leg of the journey brought Her Majesty to Washington, where she was entertained at the White House by President and First Lady Eisenhower. Although an unofficial visit, since the Queen Mother was not head of state or in line to the throne, the visit still garnered publicity, not least of all for the changing times represented in its itinerary. The trip included 3 days in Richmond and Williamsburg, more time than any representative of the British monarchy had ever spent in Virginia. The logistics for this visit would also be different. Historically, the Old Dominion's road network had been a spiderweb of dusty, tortuous country roads. But by the 1950s, investments in technology and infrastructure had begun to transform Virginia's major arteries into modern ribbons of asphalt. Rather than relying on riverboats or the railroad as in the past, this royal visit would rely on the road. On the morning of November 10th, the Queen Mother bade farewell to the Eisenhowers and set off in the British Embassy's Rolls-Royce. After crossing the Memorial Bridge into Arlington, the Secret Service handed the motorcade over to the Virginia State Police to escort the remainder of the journey to Richmond. Hundreds of onlookers lined the road as the patrol cars and the distinctive Rolls-Royce made their way down Route 1 through Fredericksburg, Ladysmith, and Ashland. As the motorcade arrived at the Capitol, church bells pealed, and John Marshall High School's band struck up God Save the Queen. The mayor of Richmond welcomed the Queen Mother to the city with a bouquet of red roses. After a brief tour of the Capitol led by Governor Stanley, the Queen Mother stepped out onto the portico to greet a crowd of more than 5,000 people. Schools and government offices granted extended lunch breaks so the people of Richmond could witness the city's first royal visit in almost 100 years. Her Majesty stepped up to the microphone and thanked the crowd for their warm welcome. "It is indeed a rare pleasure and joy to come here today," she said. "I hope to see something of your beautiful Virginia. My very best wishes to you all." After a busy day in Richmond, the motorcade set off down Broad Street and then onto Route 5 for Williamsburg. Over the next 2 days, the Queen Mother was shown living history representations of colonial Williamsburg and a recreation of the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown, done almost entirely on foot. Ellen Bagby, chairman of the Jamestown Committee for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, was initially concerned by the amount of walking involved. But in the end, she was deceived by Her Majesty's elegant fortitude. Bagby noted, "You needn't worry about that. She can outwalk any of us." Effortlessly trotting over rocky terrain in high heels was subtly reminiscent of the role the Queen Mother played a decade earlier during the darkest days of the Second World War. Every night for more than 8 months, London was bombarded by German air raids hell-bent on pummeling Britain into submission. Most of Europe's royal families had gone into hiding far away from their capital cities. But King George VI and Queen Elizabeth rejected their government's pressure to evacuate them to Canada.
Buckingham Palace has been bombed again. But this kind of savagery on king or people will never bring the Nazis one day near a victory. We shall stay on the job till it's finished.
The royal family chose to remain in London and participate in the war effort. The future Queen Elizabeth II, then only a teenager, was trained as a mechanic and eventually earned a promotion to the equivalent of a captain.
Strike up the music, roll up the drums, and head on the trumpet.
The Queen herself took a special interest in those who had lost their homes and loved ones during the air raids. When visiting the bombed-out ruins of working-class neighborhoods, she walked ahead of the king over mountains of rubble to mingle with everyday people. an unprecedented sight in a country that was still heavily class-conscious. The visibility brought by the attention the Queen devoted to some of Britain's most affected people earned her respect across the English-speaking world. At the same time, the Queen Mother was finishing her visit in Jamestown. Planning for the 350th anniversary of the first permanent English settlement in North America was already underway. The Commonwealth having been named for Queen Elizabeth I, more than a dozen generations removed from the current Queen, Elizabeth II, Jamestown felt it would be appropriate to extend an invitation to Her Majesty to attend the celebration. The Queen delightfully accepted, and Jamestown, Governor Stanley, and the State Department began planning for another royal visit of historic proportion. Jamestown's 350th anniversary would be Her Majesty's first visit to the United States as sovereign. On October 16, 1957, Queen Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, landed at Patrick Henry Airport in Newport News. The day's schedule moved quickly as the motorcade whisked the royal couple away to Jamestown. Some 50,000 people crowded the roadways and the festival park in Jamestown for the occasion. At Tower Church in Jamestown, a recreation of the 1639 Anglican parish church built by English settlers, the Queen bowed her head as Bishop Gunn offered up prayers for the President, Her Majesty, and enduring peace among their nations. The royal couple viewed a living history display of the Native American longhouse and broke from the itinerary to step aboard recreations of the 3 ships that originally brought English settlers to Virginia before moving on to colonial Williamsburg. The Queen addressed students at the College of William and Mary and partook in an informal reception at the Governor's Palace, before ending the evening with dinner at the inn at colonial Williamsburg. The several addresses the Queen delivered that day had similar themes: freedom, justice, education, and cooperation. They were all couched in immense pride of the influence of British colonialism. Perhaps Her Majesty's most striking words were among those in the address she delivered at Jamestown. This festival illustrates those 2 stories, yours and ours. They are stories in which all of us, in the United States, in Britain, and throughout the Commonwealth, take a special pride. In essence, they are both stories of experiments and adventures in freedom. What's perhaps striking to our ears today is what Her Majesty did not say. Her addresses, products of the time in which they were crafted, and whose content was largely crafted for her by Jamestown and the government, was devoid of any mention of the indispensable roles of women and enslaved people in colonial Virginia. Attitudes toward race had made tremendous progress since 1607, but still after 350 years, the contributions of enslaved Africans, and for that matter the sacrifices of Native Americans, and even white women, were still left widely unacknowledged. The following morning, the royal party set off for Washington for the next leg of their official state visit. Only a few years into her reign, this would be the first of many. Over the course of her historic 70-year-long reign, Queen Elizabeth II would visit the United States on 8 separate occasions, 4 of which included stops in Virginia, more visits than to almost any other state or commonwealth in the American Union. Virginia's next major royal visit took place during the American Bicentennial in 1976. When planning the itinerary for the trip, the Queen herself specifically asked to visit the home of Thomas Jefferson, making Charlottesville an unexpected stop on the busy tour that focused on cities in the American Northeast. Her personal secretary later related that Her Majesty was intrigued by Thomas Jefferson, one of the keenest political thinkers of his time and author of the American Declaration of Independence. On July 10th, nearly 18,000 people crowded onto the lawn to see the Queen at the University of Virginia, the university Jefferson himself established and designed. Dressed in green and white printed silk, Her Majesty's arrival was met with immense fanfare. In her address from the portico of the Rotunda, the Queen invoked her admiration of Jefferson. "It is a moving experience to stand here amidst the beauty he created at this university, and to reflect that it was for this he wished to be remembered, rather than for his authorship of the Declaration of Independence, a document which changed the course of history. A luncheon was served in her honor in the rotunda that included Virginia ham and biscuits. While the menu was relatively simple, great care had gone into rehearsing the day well in advance. The planning committee walked the anticipated route that the Queen would take through the rotunda and discovered that, given her relatively short stature of 5 feet 4 inches, the sunlight coming through the oculus would blind the Queen and obscure her vision. The committee decided to simply glue butcher paper to the outside of the oculus to block the sunlight. After the luncheon, Her Majesty was shown a simple dormitory room before setting off for Monticello a couple of miles away. Her tour of the mansion was a quiet and intimate affair, guided by the museum's curator. A woman who notably enjoyed the simplicity of country life, albeit in elegant surroundings, the Queen especially enjoyed Monticello. Precisely what it was that Queen Elizabeth admired so deeply about Thomas Jefferson isn't entirely clear. Jefferson's participation in the armed revolution that overthrew the reign of her great-great-great-great-grandfather, King George III, didn't seem to be a defining impression of one of America's most gifted founding fathers. As someone who may never have become queen at all had her uncle, King Edward VIII, never abdicated, perhaps the Queen appreciated that Jefferson, too, had found himself thrust into a role of importance that his younger self would never have expected. Perhaps it was the complexity of his ideas of freedom and democracy, and who those ideas should apply to and should not apply to as a slave owner, fascinated her from an intellectual perspective. Whatever the case, Virginians noticed the Queen's reverence for this larger-than-life figure in American history, and they respected her for it. The state visit of the Prince and Princess of Wales in 1985 carried a very different tone. While still including the traditional state dinner and visit to Arlington National Cemetery, this visit included a tightly guarded secret, something that, by the 1980s, had become even more American than Thomas Jefferson, apple pie, baseball, or tax evasion: a trip to the shopping mall. JCPenney's public relations staff contacted the British Embassy ahead of the visit and offered to organize a special shopping trip especially for the Princess of Wales. With a new specially advertised British clothing collection due to be released, a highly publicized visit from the mythical Princess Diana was a CEO's dream. The British Embassy reluctantly agreed, and plans for security began months in advance. On November 11, 1985, JCPenney and the media got precisely what they asked for. Prince Charles and Princess Diana arrived at their department store in Springfield, Virginia, to shop. The princess bought an $8 scarf at the conclusion of the trip, which boosted sales for the pattern in question. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip returned to the United States for a goodwill tour in 1991. President George Bush welcomed the Queen at the White House, although no one remembered to adjust the podium for the significant difference in height between the two heads of state. The media joked that they could see only the hat of state. Although she may not have realized it, the Queen wasn't finished with the ghost of that old admired Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. For on this particular visit, Her Majesty was scheduled to deliver an historic address to a joint session of Congress. In the United Kingdom, one of the monarch's roles in government is to open the new session of Parliament roughly every year. In a dazzling display of pomp and tradition, whose origins trace back some 900 years, both chambers of the British legislature convene in the House of Lords to hear the speech from the throne. Written by the political party in power and outlining their legislative agenda for the upcoming year, the ritual harkens to the Middle Ages when the monarch, then the crux of political power in England, would direct Parliament themselves on how to legislate. Today, the monarchy no longer engages in direct political activity. Instead, the Crown's constitutional role is to advise the Prime Minister and the government through the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. A similar government structured with checks and balances like that of their mother country inspired the Founding Fathers. After the American Revolution, the framers of the U.S. Constitution stipulated a requirement that the American president deliver to Congress information on the State of the Union that Congress would find pertinent. America's first president, George Washington, fulfilled this constitutional duty by delivering a State of the Union speech to Congress every year. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, one of the young republic's keenest political thinkers, felt it was inappropriate for a president to address Congress. It was Congress, after all, who was intended to be the real fulcrum of power in the Republic, not the President. In particular, he felt that the President addressing Congress was too reminiscent of the British sovereign's speech from the throne. After being elected as America's second president, Jefferson discontinued the practice of reading the State of the Union speech aloud before Congress. Instead, he fulfilled his constitutional duty by dispatching his written speech to the Capitol, where a clerk would read it aloud before a joint session of Congress. Every president for more than 100 years did the same, keen to follow Jefferson's precedent and the statement it made about the delicate relationship between the executive and legislative branches of government. The practice of a president reading the speech aloud in person was only revived by Woodrow Wilson in 1913, a president who felt differently about the role that executive power should play in Washington. Thomas Jefferson and his 19th century successors would be shocked to see a president addressing Congress, never mind a reigning British monarch, the rejection of whose authority forms the very bedrock of American statehood. As the Queen assumed the Speaker's podium, she chose to dissolve any tension associated with the historical gravity of the occasion by employing her legendary wit. Still fresh on everyone's minds, Her Majesty recalled the faux pas at the White House podium 2 days earlier.
I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Her brief address invoked the wisdom of another American president from the past and acknowledged the shared heritage of democracy that so deeply characterizes the Anglo-American alliance.
The concept, so simply described by Abraham Lincoln, as government by the people, of the people, for the people, is fundamental to our two nations. Your Congress and our Parliament are the twin pillars of our civilizations and the chief among the many treasures that we have inherited from our predecessors. Some people believe that power grows from the barrel of a gun. So it can, but history shows that it never grows well, nor for very long. Force in the end is sterile. We have gone a better way. Our societies rest on mutual agreement, on contract, and on consensus.
The new millennium had barely begun when the Jamestown Foundation started planning the celebration of the historic settlement's quadricentennial. As had been done for the 350th anniversary in 1957, Jamestown once again invited Queen Elizabeth II to return for the 400th anniversary. The Queen readily accepted.
And with breaking news, right now the Virginia Tech campus is on lockdown after reports of a man with a gun on campus.
Just a month before the visit, a tragic shooting occurred on the campus of Virginia Tech in Blacksburg that claimed the lives of 32 students and educators. Up until that point, it was one of the most devastating shootings in American history. The Queen wanted to visit Blacksburg so she could express her condolences in person. But with such short notice, it was impossible to plan for the complex security and logistical requirements that would be involved with traveling hundreds of miles out of the way to Southwest Virginia. The Queen would have to think of another way to express her solidarity. On May 3rd, the Queen's chartered British Airways jet landed at Richmond International Airport. A motorcade consisting of 20 patrol cars and 15 motorcycles escorted the Queen to the Capitol. State employees had been given leave that day to ease parking congestion, but Capitol Square was crowded for blocks in every direction. As Her Majesty ascended the same steps her mother had spoken from half a century earlier, flanked by cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, it soon became apparent that the tone of this visit was different from her visit in 1957. This experience was more inclusive of Virginia's rich cultural heritage. Earlier that year, Virginia's legislature became the first in the nation to pass a resolution expressing profound regret for the treatment of Africans and Native Americans in colonial Virginia. Passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, the statement set the tone for the upcoming quadricentennial of the first permanent British settlement in North America. Representatives of Virginia's 8 Native American tribes performed a ceremonial dance and were amongst the crowd of lawmakers invited to hear the Queen's speech in the Senate chamber. Also in the crowd was the now 100-year-old attorney Oliver Hill, who had been instrumental in bringing about the 1954 Supreme Court decision that outlawed segregation in public schools. Speculation for months had mounted as to what Her Majesty would say in the several addresses she had planned for the state visit. Some journalists expected she would issue an explicit apology for British imperialism and its exploitation of African slaves and Native Americans. Conversely, others felt that apologizing for the sins of distant generations would be inappropriate. Naturally, the speech Her Majesty delivered handled the controversy with grace, whilst also acknowledging the advancing temperature of social change.
Governor Kane, members of the General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your generous welcome to Virginia. Prince Philip and I are delighted to be here in your state capital today, designed by that great Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. As a state and as a nation, you are still coming to terms with the dreadful events at Virginia Tech on the 16th of April. My heart goes out to the students, friends, and families of all those killed, and to the many others who have been affected, some of whom I shall be meeting shortly. On behalf of the people of the United Kingdom, I extend my deepest sympathies at this time of such grief and sorrow. When I visited 50 years ago, we celebrated the 350th anniversary largely from the perspective of those settlers, in terms of the exploration of new worlds, the spread of values, and of the English language, and the sacrifice of those early pioneers. These remain great attributes, and we still appreciate their impact today. But 50 years on, we are now in a position to reflect more candidly on the Jamestown legacy. Human progress rarely comes without cost. And those early years in Jamestown, when 3 great civilizations came together for the first time, Western European, Native American, and African, released a train of events which continues to have a profound social impact, not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom and Europe. The melting pot metaphor captures one of the great strengths of your country and is an inspiration to others around the world as we face the continuing social challenges ahead.
After the speech, survivors of the Virginia Tech shooting and their families met with the 81-year-old monarch. Buckingham Palace had intended to keep the meeting secret until the day of, but much to the palace's disappointment, news of the reception was leaked to American media outlets in advance. In return for her kindness, the Queen was gifted a bracelet of 32 polished stones, one for each victim of the shooting, in the school's colors of maroon and orange. Afterward, Governor Kane held a reception for Her Majesty in the Executive Mansion. Barbersville Vineyards in Orange County provided 2 wines for the reception, an Octagon and a Viognier Reserve. Although the Queen didn't have time to sample either of the wines herself, they clearly made an impression to British diplomats. Both wines were served 4 years later in a reception the British Embassy held to celebrate the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton. After delivering her speech at the Capitol, the Queen continued on to Jamestown and Williamsburg. Her address from the balcony of the Wren Building at the College of William and Mary, and her various stops around the recreated colonial settlements were faint echoes of her 1957 visit to the colonial triangle. The Jamestown Quadricentennial was a success. At 81 years of age, it was the last time Queen Elizabeth II would visit the United States. Within a few short years, the Queen's age was becoming apparent. By 2019, the 93-year-old monarch had become too frail to even bear the weight of the imperial state crown. Queen Elizabeth II became the longest reigning monarch in British history when she celebrated her 70th year on the throne in 2022. With the aid of a walking stick, she eased up to the balcony at Buckingham Palace to acknowledge the crowd and the world's media outlets. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin officially recognized June 2nd as a day of celebration for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. It was well known behind palace doors that the Queen's health was rapidly deteriorating. Determined to keep working until the very end, Her Majesty adjourned her weekly meeting with Prime Minister Liz Truss in the same manner she had ended meetings with prime ministers for more than 70 years, going as far back as Winston Churchill. She simply told Truss, "I'll see you next week." But there would be no next week.
This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. In a statement, the palace said the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The world's media covered the Queen's death in painstaking detail. Media outlets in Virginia, from Norfolk to Arlington to Bristol, reminisced on Virginia's long and unique relationship with the late Queen. Governor Glenn Youngkin's office released a statement on the death of Queen Elizabeth II. "Today we sadly mourn the loss of a transcendent leader, Queen Elizabeth II," the statement began. The Queen's consistent tenderness for the Commonwealth and Virginians will never be forgotten. Virginia's unique place in American history has given the Old Dominion a long and storied connection to the British monarchy. A product of their respective times, every visit from a reigning monarch or minor member of the royal family offers us a unique historical lens. That perspective tells the story of how some things, like journalistic sensationalism or the need to maintain mutually beneficial alliances, never change, and how other things, including the ways we choose to remember our complicated past, are constantly evolving. Inside the state capitol in Richmond, immediately next to the entrance to the House Gallery, hangs a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II that bears her signature. It is a humble and personal representation of the relationship that exists between the Commonwealth of Virginia and one of history's most influential and enduring institutions.